Okay, so today we're going to talk about an airworthiness directive that's applicable to certain Lycoming engines. It's AD number 960910, which basically calls for operators and owners of certain Lycoming engines to replace oil pumps that may have defective impellers and or materials used that may not be up to standards. So in my case, we're talking about a Lycoming AEIO360 B4A, which is an aerobatic engine that's installed in a 1982 Pit Special. This engine was basically installed new from the factory in 1981. And upon purchasing the aircraft, I inspected all the logbooks and came across an entry that was made by an AME that had reviewed AD number 960910 and had written it off as not applicable by serial number, by engine serial number. So I went on to read about the AD and took it a step further. I called Lycoming with the engine serial number, and they advised me that there's a very good possibility that this engine might have the affected pump. So, as you can see with the accessory gear case sitting on my desk, I took it upon myself to take the accessory casing off the engine in order to inspect the pump itself. Now, there are other techniques that can be used to inspect the pump to determine whether this AD is applicable or not. It involves accessing the oil pump via a mirror through the fuel pump housing. But I decided to take the accessory gear case off to make it simpler and to make it 100% clear whether this AD was applicable or not. So to take the accessory case apart was relatively straightforward. Both magnetos needed to come out for a 500-hour inspection and a partial overhaul. It involves taking the fuel pump off, taking the tachometer drive off, all hydraulic lines, and also removing all the bolts that bolt the accessory casing onto the engine itself. So here's the outside view. So upon taking it apart, taking it off the engine, this is what I was faced with. So for those of you that do recognize it, yes it is. It's the pump that's affected by the AD. Certain older Lycoming engines do employ these types of pumps, but with a shaft, a driven shaft that is fixed to the body itself by a cotter pin. If I interpreted the AD960910 correctly, those pumps are not affected by this AD. If you take a look at the AD itself, engines that incorporate oil pumps fitted with an aluminum impeller and shaft must comply with paragraph C of this AD, which is basically the case here. So paragraph C states, for all other affected engines, replace any aluminum oil pump impeller and shaft assembly with a hardened steel impeller. Now the key word here is the aluminum oil pump impeller and shaft assembly. This is an aluminum oil impeller and shaft assembly, which means that the impeller is part of the shaft. If your shaft contains a cotter pin, which basically fixes it to the oil pump body, the unit or this part is not considered an assembly. If the oil impeller, the driven impeller, and the shaft that it sits on are not one piece, they are not considered an assembly. But again, from what I've seen from my pump here, probably wouldn't be a bad idea to take it apart and to inspect the affected parts, which may have worn out prematurely. So I went ahead, took all the lock wire that held the three nuts in place, took them off with the washers, and this is what the pump looks like once it's taken apart. So the whole assembly just slides off the casing here. So you can clearly see the drive shaft, which is attached to the driving impeller, which is made out of steel. The driving impeller in turn drives the driven impeller, which is made out of aluminum. You can tell it's grayish color, which is fixed onto its shaft. So this is a shaft and aluminum impeller assembly. Here's where the problematic area with this pump lies. You can see here, as I'm actuating the drive shaft back and forth, there's a large amount of free play that exists between the drive shaft and the drive impeller. Now I'm holding these two impellers here with my fingers so they can't move. What you're hearing and what you're seeing is the actual free play that exists between the drive shaft and the impeller. So let's take them apart. The drive shaft comes out simply by pulling it out. Here it is. The drive impeller comes out like so. Here it is. You can clearly see it's made out of steel. And the driven impeller and shaft assembly comes out of the body like so. You can clearly see as well too that the driven impeller is made out of aluminum. So these parts were definitely affected by AD 960910. Let's take a closer look. Here's the drive impeller. Not sure if you'll be able to see through the camera or not, but on the inside, the flat part that rests onto the drive shaft itself has worn itself out excessively. So you can see here the indent caused by the material that was removed from the premature wear. So Lycoming decided that the material they used for these gears was obviously not suitable for this part to last the lifetime of the engine, or the duration that it's supposed to last. You could see as well too that the flat surface is no longer flat, it's dome shaped from the shaft twisting and the excessive free play that exists between the two parts. And one thing that's worth mentioning as well is, although 960910 doesn't mention it, I think it's extremely crucial to properly inspect the drive shaft itself. And here's why. The drive shaft consists of two lands that basically engage the drive gear. And you could see the area that wore on the gear also affected the drive shaft. Just make sure everyone can see that. You could clearly see that an area of extreme wear has occurred on the shaft itself, which is the reason why so much free play existed between the drive shaft and the drive gear. So again, I'll engage these two parts. You could see by visually looking at the wear marks how this part engages, like so. And just look at the amount of free play. There's quite a bit of free play in here. If we were to spin the parts around so that it mates on the unworn surface, you can see that a lot of that free play has been eliminated, which kind of makes you appreciate the AD. So this was only a matter of time before these two parts would have eventually failed. The problem is not so much as the amount of free play that exists now, is that once this part has exceeded its allowable tolerance, it'll wear itself out at an exponential rate. And it wouldn't have taken it much longer for the part to completely wear itself to the point where the part would eventually fail. And of course, as anybody knows, if an oil pump fails, well, you know the result, which is not the most ideal result when you're flying an aircraft like a Pit Special. So here are the two parts. So what I decided to do, instead of just buying the kit that Lycoming recommends, and also the kit that's specified in the AD, the kit in question is kit number 05K19423-S, which is basically a driven impeller and shaft assembly along with a drive gear. So the kit basically consists of a replacement set of gears. I decided to go ahead and change the shaft as well too, for obvious reasons. Pricing the shaft and the replacement gears brought me to the point where I had to decide whether to buy the shaft and the gears or to go ahead and buy an entire pump assembly. So in comes Canadian Aero Manufacturing. So I contacted these guys, I found them on the internet, and basically what they sell is a kit which consists of the drive gear, the improved drive gear, which is basically, physically it looks like the same part, but it's different. It's nitrided, it's got the N stamped on top of it. This one here is part number 18109. So this is part number 18109, which is the improved version of the old part. And also the driven impeller, which is carburized, which consists of a steel gear mounted to the shaft, or a steel gear and shaft. It's one piece, actually. It's machined out of one piece. This is part number 18110. And also part number 61174, which is the actual drive shaft itself, a direct replacement for the previous part. And last but not least, the pump body. The pump body is 78531. Now if you've noticed, the pump body for this particular engine, this body is suitable for this engine. But if you do carry out the AD, you should be aware that different bodies do exist for different applications, obviously. For certain engines that do not have a plunger type fuel pump, example, if your engine is running a gear driven fuel pump, then this body, part number 78531, may not be suitable for your application. How can you tell? Well, take a look at your accessory housing. You can tell my pump here, this was the original pump that was installed in the engine, part number 78527, which has been superseded by 78528, which is basically the same part, except it has provisions for an extra oil channel to be routed through to the fuel pump. Now again, it's not applicable to this engine, so you can see where the pump itself sits in the accessory gear case. The small hole, which would normally lead to the lubrication port for the fuel pump, simply gets blanked off. So for this engine, the drilled body is not required. But you should at least be aware of it so that you can purchase the right body for your application. So these components consist of the required fix for AD960910, and in my opinion, it is the absolute best thing to do if you're replacing this oil pump, instead of just purchasing the gears themselves. So the parts lay in like so, and of course it comes with instructions. You can either, I don't know who else makes them, but that's who I bought them from. And the whole unit sits inside the accessory gear case like so. And of course the instructions provide instructions on how to determine if the proper clearances exist between the pump and the pump housing, and how to conclude the final assembly. So there you go. Hopefully that clarifies AD number 960910. And it's evidence that you can never be too prudent when it comes to maintenance, especially when it's in your own aircraft and you're the one flying it. So I'm glad that I got this modification done. It cost me $450, but you know, that's life in aviation. It'll lead to a much safer operation as far as this is concerned, even though this particular aircraft is in the amateur built or experimental category. In Canada, airworthiness directives are not mandatory for this category. I still find it extremely valuable to have access to all the information provided by Transport Canada, and obviously in this case it saved me a lot down the road. So I hope you enjoyed, and happy flying.